The disrespect. Beverly Hills shimmered that evening like a jewel set under the velvet sky. The air carried the scent of luxury, mingling the faint perfume of roses planted along the boulevards with the purr of exotic engines as Lamborghinis and Bentleys lined up outside La Lumiere, a restaurant whose name alone conjured images of prestige, refinement, and exclusivity. La Lumiere was not simply a place to eat. It was a theater where the city's elite performed rituals of wealth, power, and elegance. From the crystal chandeliers that cascaded golden light across every polished surface, to the gilded mirrors reflecting gowns stitched by world-renowned designers, every corner of this establishment was designed to whisper one truth. You are among the chosen few if you dine here. Inside, couples dressed in tailored suits and sparkling gowns sat at tables adorned with silver cutlery and folded napkins that looked more like art than cloth. The quiet murmur of polite laughter mixed with the clinking of crystal glasses as expensive wines poured and gourmet dishes arrived like works of art upon porcelain plates. The entire restaurant pulsed with an air of superiority. A world where appearances spoke louder than actions, where attire decided your worth before you opened your mouth. For regulars, this was normal. For outsiders, it was intimidating. That evening, as the grand glass doors swung open, a tall figure stepped inside and every head turned, as if choreographed. The man's height was impossible to ignore. Over 7 feet of towering presence filled the doorway. His shoulders were broad, his frame powerful, yet his attire made him look almost ordinary. A plain gray t-shirt hugged his upper body. Sweatpants hung comfortably loose, and on his feet rested a pair of sneakers that had clearly seen better days. He looked like a man who had walked off a basketball court after practice and wandered into the wrong place by mistake. That man was Shaquille O'Neal. Some guests whispered his name under their breath. A few widened their eyes in recognition. Shaq was a legend, an athlete who had conquered the NBA, a figure whose fame extended far beyond sports into business, entertainment, and philanthropy. Yet in that moment, he wasn't dressed for the part. He wasn't wrapped in tailored suits or expensive cologne. He had walked into Beverly Hills' Temple of Elegance as if he had just strolled out of a gym. The contrast was stark. For some, it was amusing. For others, it was unacceptable. Standing behind the reception desk was Emma, a young waitress whose uniform was pressed with military precision, her hair tied into a flawless bun, her makeup highlighting features that carried an air of self-assurance. She had worked at La Lumiere long enough to adopt its culture, an almost unspoken belief that the restaurant was not just serving food, but serving exclusivity. In her mind, she was not merely an employee, but a guardian of this world of refinement. And like any guardian, she judged who truly belonged. When her eyes fell upon Shaq, Emma's lips curled into a smile that was more mockery than warmth. She glanced quickly at his sneakers, then at his t-shirt, her brows arching in disbelief. To her, this man did not belong here. Yes, she recognized who he was. She had seen his face on television before. But the arrogance instilled by years of serving only the wealthiest made her believe fame was nothing if not wrapped in Armani or Gucci. "Good evening," she said, her voice polite but laced with condescension. "This is La Lumiere, a fine dining establishment. Are you sure you want to eat here?" The words were delivered smoothly but with the sharp edge of insult, loud enough for diners at nearby tables to hear. A ripple moved through the room as people turned slightly to watch. Whispers sparked like tiny flames. A man in a navy suit smirked to his wife. A group of young women giggled softly. To them, the situation was already entertaining. A celebrity, yes, but stripped of his glamorous armor, being told he might not belong. Shaq did not flinch. His face remained calm, his smile light and unbothered, his deep voice steady as he responded, "Yes, I'd like to try dining here tonight." The simplicity of his tone unsettled Emma. She had expected hesitation, perhaps even embarrassment. Instead, he looked at her as though her judgment had no weight in his world. She blinked, then forced a laugh. "Very well," she said. "Let me check for availability." But in her mind, she was already planning. "Let's see how long you last here," she thought. "Wait until you see the menu." She led him through the restaurant, but not with the courtesy she displayed to other guests. Her steps were deliberate, exaggerated, a silent performance meant to showcase her authority. Shaq followed calmly, each stride unhurried, his presence so immense that even without speaking, he commanded the room. Yet Emma was determined to put him in his place. Past rows of beautifully arranged tables under the chandeliers, where the air smelled faintly of roses and caviar, she continued walking until they reached a far corner near the kitchen. The lighting was dimmer here, the atmosphere less refined. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen could be heard faintly, and the smell of sautéed garlic drifted in from the swinging doors. Stopping abruptly, Emma gestured to the table with an overly sweet smile. "This spot should suit your style perfectly," she said, dropping the menu onto the table with a thud that carried the weight of disdain. Some diners gasped softly. A few shook their heads. They knew what she was doing, and though none spoke up, sympathy flickered in their eyes. At a central table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, a distinguished older couple who had been dining at La Lumiere for decades, observed quietly. Mr. Carter leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Impressively composed. Most men would have walked out by now." Shaq simply smiled, nodded, and sat down. His movements were slow, deliberate, filled with a calm dignity that clashed with the insult he had just endured. His smile did not falter. His eyes carried no anger, no shame. He adjusted himself in the chair and folded his hands, looking as though he were right where he belonged. His silence spoke louder than any retort could have. Emma, unsatisfied with his lack of reaction, returned with a menu. She leaned slightly over, her tone mocking though disguised as helpful. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" she asked, pointing deliberately to the most expensive item on the menu. "The most luxurious dish here is $350. She emphasized the figure, her eyes locked on his face, waiting for a flicker of doubt, a crack in his composure. But Shaq looked up, amusement dancing faintly in his gaze. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, calm as if he were ordering a glass of water. His deep voice was polite but steady, unshaken by the cost. Emma froze for half a second, her smirk faltering. She hadn't expected him to choose the priciest dish so effortlessly. Quickly recovering, she laughed softly, though the edge of mockery remained. "Of course," she said. "I'll place the order. I hope you know how to appreciate it." Her words carried condescension, but Shaq remained calm, leaning back in his chair, his presence commanding even in silence. Around him, whispers grew louder. Curios, IT building. Who was this man who took insult after insult without breaking? Why didn't he simply leave? Why did he look so unbothered? What Emma didn't know, what no one in that restaurant yet realized, was that the man she mocked, the man she tried to humiliate, was not just a customer. He was more than a celebrity, more than a retired athlete. Shaquille O'Neal was a businessman, a philanthropist, and, most importantly in this story, the hidden owner of La Lumiere. Tonight, this restaurant wasn't just a place where Shaq came to dine, it was the stage upon which an unforgettable lesson was about to be taught. And as Emma walked away, satisfied for the moment, the energy in the room shifted ever so slightly. Guests leaned in to whisper, staff glanced toward the tall man in the corner, and a quiet storm of truth began to build, one that would soon sweep through every corner of La Lumiere and leave no one, least of all Emma, unchanged. The hidden test. The quiet hum of conversation returned to La Lumiere after Emma walked away, but the energy of the restaurant had shifted. Every guest had taken notice of the exchange, and though they pretended to focus on their meals, curiosity tugged at their attention. It wasn't every evening that such an uncomfortable drama unfolded inside Beverly Hills' most prestigious dining hall. Yet, here it was. A towering man, known across the world, sitting silently in the corner, seemingly unfazed by the arrogance of a waitress who believed she was protecting the sanctity of refinement. The golden chandeliers overhead spilled light onto every glittering surface, but in that corner near the kitchen the glow felt softer, almost shadowed, as if the universe itself wanted to draw a boundary around Shaq, creating a space of quiet contrast. He sat with his massive frame folded into the chair, his arms resting calmly on the table. There was no trace of irritation on his face, no defensive posture. Instead, his expression carried the same serene confidence he had once worn during Ion Ship games, when the pressure of millions of eyes could not shake him. To the other staff moving across the floor, it was a strange sight. Lisa, a younger waitress with kind eyes and a more humble nature, passed by and caught his gaze briefly. Unlike Emma, Lisa had grown up far from the glamour of Beverly Hills. She knew what it meant to work double shifts, to budget every dollar, to smile at customers even when exhaustion tugged at her. In that fleeting moment, when she looked at Shaq, she saw not a man out of place, but a man choosing calmness despite insult. Her heart tightened with respect. She wanted to step in, to treat him with fairness, but she also knew Emma's dominance among the staff. Interfering would not be without consequence. Still, Lisa whispered to herself, he deserves kindness, not ridicule. At a nearby table, the Carters continued to observe. Mr. Carter, a man whose wealth had been built in law and investments, was no stranger to arrogance in high society. Yet something about this scene stirred him. He leaned closer to his wife, lowering his voice. He doesn't bite back. Do you see that? She tried to embarrass him, but he refuses to lower himself. Mrs. Carter, graceful in her pearls, nodded slowly. True grace never needs to shout, she murmured, her eyes softening as she studied Shaq's patience. Meanwhile, Emma strutted toward the bar to place his order, her mind spinning with self-satisfaction. To her, this was a small victory. She had placed him in the corner, humiliated him subtly before the crowd, and now she would serve him his expensive dish with an air that suggested it was wasted on him. She believed herself clever, mistaking cruelty for wit. But arrogance has a way of blinding people to the storms it silently invites. Shaq leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a moment to breathe in the room. The delicate notes of classical piano floated softly from the speakers. The clinking of glasses punctuated conversations that carried words like mergers and stocks and film premieres. He had lived in this world long enough to know its surface-level rituals. He had seen people measure one another not by the kindness of their hearts, but by the cut of their suits, the glitter of their jewelry, the brands stitched into their collars. It never bothered him. He had learned early in life that material worth was the weakest measure of a person. As he sat there, he recalled the countless lessons his mother had instilled in him as a child growing up in modest circumstances. Respect everyone, she used to say, from the janitor sweeping the floor to the CEO sitting at the top. You never know whose hand you'll need one day, and you never know whose heart you might touch with a simple kindness. Those words had guided him through his career, through his ventures, through his investments. He carried them into every business meeting, every endorsement deal, every act of philanthropy. And tonight, in this glittering palace of pride, those words held him steady. When Emma returned with a glass of water, she set it on the table with just a little too much force, droplets splashing onto the surface. Your order will take some time, she said curtly, as though she were reminding him of his place. Shaq simply nodded, his smile easy. No problem, he replied. I have time. The exchange was brief, but again the diners near him noticed. A young man at the adjacent table whispered to his date, "He doesn't even get angry. I don't think I could sit there like that if it were me." His date nodded thoughtfully. "That's real strength," she replied softly. "Not shouting. Just being unbothered," Emma, of all course, had no idea her every move was weaving threads of judgment not only against Shaq, but against herself. She believed she was amusing the room, that people admired her authority. In reality, the crowd was shifting, slowly, their admiration leaning toward the calm man in sweatpants rather than the waitress with sharp words. Minutes later, Lisa approached Shaq's table cautiously, carrying a small basket of bread rolls. She wasn't supposed to serve his table, that was Emma's territory, but something compelled her. She placed the basket gently in front of him, her voice warm but quiet. "Compliments of the kitchen," she said. It was a small act, but her sincerity shone through. Shaq met her eyes and gave a nod of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying more weight than the words themselves. Lisa smiled faintly before walking away, her heart lighter for having done what felt right. From the far end of the room, Emma noticed. Her lips tightened. She didn't like anyone interfering with her performance, and Lisa's simple kindness felt like a betrayal. She made a note to scold her later. For now, she returned to Shaq's table with a forced smile. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked, her tone dipped in sarcasm. Shaq looked at her calmly. "Yes, thank you." The simplicity of his reply deflated her attempt at mockery. She had expected him to snap, to react, to give her fuel for further disdain. Instead, his composure left her fumbling for her next move. In that moment, what Emma failed to realize was that she was being tested too. Every cruel word she spoke, every condescending gesture she made, was being observed not only by the diners, but by the man she sought to humiliate. A man who understood that life always revealed character under pressure. This evening was no accident. It was an unspoken test of patience, humility, and respect. What neither Emma nor the crowd knew yet was that Shaq was not just testing her. He was also testing everyone else. The silent diners who watched but said nothing. The staff who allowed arrogance to go unchecked. The entire system that equated elegance with attire. He was teaching without a classroom, mentoring without declaring himself a teacher. The true revelation was still hidden, but its seeds were already sown in that dim corner of La Lumière. And as Emma walked away once more, convinced she still held control, Shaq folded his massive hands together and thought, "Sometimes the greatest lessons are taught without a single raised voice." A lesson in respect. The evening moved steadily forward, but the tension inside La Lumière had begun to shift. What had started as whispered amusement at Emma's bold insults now grew into a strange silence of reflection. People still spoke, but their eyes often wandered toward the tall figure in the corner, a man who sat so still and composed that his very patience became a kind of authority. There was no anger in his eyes, no hint of frustration in his posture. Instead, there was a calm strength, the kind that unsettles arrogance because it cannot be shaken. The kitchen doors swung open and closed, servers bustled with trays, and the pianist at the far end of the hall let his fingers dance across the ivory keys. Yet in the middle of all this polished chaos, Shaquille O'Neal remained unmoved, as if he were the steady anchor in a storm of pretension. It was this unbothered composure that began to gnaw at Emma. She had expected him to crack by now, to show embarrassment, to perhaps even lash out in anger. But instead, he seemed to almost enjoy her attempts, not because he welcomed disrespect, but because he treated her barbs as though they were powerless against him. Emma brought the first dish of bread and soup to his table. She hit it down with theatrical precision, her smile dripping with sarcasm. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone suggesting he wouldn't make it through the full course. Shaq looked at her kindly. his deep voice rolling out like a calm wave. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The sincerity in his words stung her more than any insult could have. She expected resistance, but instead he gave gratitude. His politeness, offered so effortlessly in the face of arrogance, became a mirror she could not avoid. Yet pride is stubborn, and rather than admit she might be wrong, Emma told herself that he was only pretending, that surely he would reveal his discomfort sooner or later. As the courses arrived one by one, Shaq ate slowly, thoughtfully, as though savoring not just the food, but the atmosphere itself. He leaned back in his chair occasionally, scanning the room, watching people without judgment. To anyone else, it might have seemed that he was simply enjoying a meal, but in truth, he was observing the human spirit at work. He saw the way diners tried to pretend they weren't watching him, the way some shook their heads at Emma's arrogance, the way others looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. He saw Lisa's quiet kindness as she stole glances from across the room, hoping her small gesture of bread earlier had meant something. He even noticed the Carters, whose eyes carried a wisdom that came only with years of seeing both the best and worst in people. Finally, the filet mignon Rossini arrived, the most expensive dish on the menu, a plate so perfectly arranged it looked more like art than food. Emma carried it with exaggerated elegance, setting it down before Shaq as though she were laying jewels before a king she did not respect. "Here it is," she announced loudly enough for other tables to hear. "The most expensive dish we have. I hope it meets your standards." Her tone ripped with mockery, but Shaq's eyes simply lifted to hers, calm and steady. "It looks wonderful," he said, his voice steady, his gratitude genuine. Then he added softly but firmly, "You know, respect doesn't cost anything, but it's worth more than what's on this plate." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Conversations around them paused, forks hovered above plates, and even Emma froze, blinking at him. For the first time, her smirk faltered. She hadn't expected him to speak, and certainly not like that. His tone wasn't angry, it wasn't defensive. It was instructive, almost fatherly, the way a mentor might remind a young student of something they had forgotten. Emma's cheeks flushed, but she quickly forced a laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm just doing my job," she muttered, trying to hide the crack in her composure. But the truth was, she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. Mr. Carter, still watching from his table, whispered to his wife, "Did you hear that? He didn't insult her back. He gave her a lesson." Mrs. Carter smiled softly. "That's real power," she said. "Teaching without shouting." Shaq cut into the dish and took his time eating, each bite unhurried. Between mouthfuls, he would glance around the room, acknowledging people with nods or small smiles, as if to say, "I see you too." Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. Diners who had once laughed at Emma's mockery now felt uneasy about their silence. Some shifted in their seats, ashamed of their complicity. Others looked at Shaq with newfound respect, realizing that his patience was not weakness, but a quiet strength few possessed. After a while, Emma returned with the dessert menu. She placed it on the table, her voice sharper now, as if to regain control. "Would you like something sweet?" she asked, her sarcasm returning. Shaq looked up and his deep eyes locked onto hers. "Sweetness," he said gently, "comes not from what we serve, but how we serve it. You might want to remember that." Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to snap back, to dismiss his words again, but for some reason she couldn't. Something about the way he spoke, the calm authority, the gentleness wrapped around undeniable truth, silenced her. She turned on her heel and walked away quickly, but her steps were not as confident as before. The room had grown quieter now, the pianist's notes filling the silence with soft chords. People leaned toward one another, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some admired his composure. Others were humbled by it. A few even began questioning themselves. How many times had they judged someone too quickly, dismissed someone based on their clothes or their demeanor? How many times had they been an Emma in their own lives without realizing it? Lisa, emboldened by Shaq's calm dignity, approached his table again, this time with a small plate of complimentary dessert she had arranged herself. She set it down quietly, her voice soft. "This one's from me," she said. "I hope it brightens your evening." Shaq looked at her, his smile widening slightly. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Kindness always does." Lisa blushed faintly and hurried away, but her heart soared. In that moment, she understood that true greatness wasn't loud or boastful. It was humble, patient, and kind. By now, the Carters were no longer whispering. Mr. Carter raised his glass in Shaq's direction, a silent gesture of respect. Shaq nodded back, acknowledging the couple without words. The exchange was subtle, but its meaning was clear. Respect recognizes respect. Emma, watching all this unfold from the reception desk, felt something stirring inside her that she hadn't expected. It wasn't just annoyance anymore, it was confusion. Why wasn't this man reacting? Why wasn't he angry? Why wasn't he leaving in shame like she had predicted? Instead, he was changing the atmosphere of the entire restaurant without lifting a finger. And worst of all, she could feel the room turning against her. Her arrogance, once her armor, now felt like a weight dragging her down. She didn't know it yet, but this evening was becoming her own hidden lesson. For Shaq wasn't just teaching her about respect. He was teaching everyone watching that true strength is not in domination, but in humility, not in belittling, but in lifting others up. And as the plates were cleared and the evening moved into its later hours, the stage was quietly being set for the moment when truth could no longer remain hidden. Soon, Emma and every guest in La Lumiere would learn that the man they had underestimated, the man they had judged, was not only capable of affording the meal, but was the very reason the restaurant even existed. The revelation was coming, and with it, a wave of humility that would wash over everyone present. The big reveal. The night at La Lumiere deepened, and as the chandeliers glistened like constellations overhead, the restaurant's atmosphere carried an almost tangible tension. The air no longer buzzed with the same shallow laughter that had filled the hall earlier. Instead, there was an unspoken anticipation, as though everyone sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. Shaq still sat calmly in his corner, his massive frame at ease, his eyes soft yet commanding. The silence he carried with him seemed to ripple outward, affecting the very rhythm of the room. Diners who once smirked at his casual attire now felt unsettled, their earlier judgment. It's turning into quiet shame. Emma, however, was not ready to surrender. She had spent years in this restaurant polishing her sense of superiority, treating her position as though it gave her the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. Watching Shaq remain calm and unshaken despite her efforts irritated her deeply. Every time she brought him a dish, every time he replied with politeness instead of anger, it felt like a slap to her pride. She told herself that she still held power, that no matter how composed he appeared, she could still make him feel small. But beneath her pride, a faint unease began to gnaw. The Carters, dignified in their quiet observation, exchanged knowing glances. Mr. Carter leaned slightly forward, resting his hand on the table. "He's waiting," he whispered to his wife. "I don't know for what, but he's waiting, and when the moment comes, this entire room will know it." Mrs. Carter nodded, her pearl necklace catching the glow of the chandelier. "Patience is a weapon in its own right," she said softly. "Most people don't understand its power until it's too late." Lisa, meanwhile, continued to glance toward the corner, her heart torn between admiration and worry. She admired Shaq's calm strength, but she worried about how much more Emma would push him. She knew Emma's temper too well. She had seen her humiliate guests before, though never someone so well known. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight felt like more than just an arrogant waitress crossing a line. It felt like the entire restaurant was being tested. And then, just as if fate itself had decided to escalate the drama, the front doors of La Lumiere swung open again. A man stepped inside, dressed immaculately in a sharp black suit, his shoes polished until they gleamed, his hair slicked back with precision. His presence carried arrogance in every step, and unlike Shaq, his attire screamed wealth and entitlement. This man was Richard Hanover, the owner of a rival fine dining restaurant just down the street, a man who had long resented the success of La Lumiere. He wasn't there to dine. He was there to observe, to compare, to gloat if he found the opportunity. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw him. In her mind, here was a man who represented what she considered true refinement. She hurried to the entrance, her smile now genuine for the first time all evening. "Mr. Hanover!" she exclaimed, her voice warm and deferential. "What an honor to see you here tonight." Hanover smirked, nodding as though her admiration was nothing more than his due. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes eventually landing on the corner where Shaq sat, his brows furrowed slightly. "What's he doing here?" he asked Emma, his voice low but dripping with disdain. Emma seized the chance to prove her loyalty to her imagined social order. She leaned closer and whispered, "Oh, don't worry. He doesn't belong here. I've been making sure he knows it." Hanover chuckled, shaking his head. "Good. A place like this shouldn't be tainted by casual guests." He said the words loudly enough that several diners heard him, their eyes widening at the audacity. Some looked away in discomfort, others exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing for Emma to be arrogant. It was another for a supposed man of stature to openly demean someone in public. But again, Shaq did not flinch. His eyes met Hanover's across the room, calm, steady, unyielding. The silence between them, carried more weight than words ever could. Hanover smirked, mistaking Shaq's calmness for submission, and turned back toward Emma. "You're doing the right thing," he told her. "Some people just don't fit into worlds like ours." The remark cut through the restaurant like a blade. Lisa gasped softly, her hand tightening around the tray she carried. The Carters exchanged a glance of disgust. Even the pianist hesitated briefly, a wrong note slipping through before he recovered. Shaq finally moved. He placed his napkin neatly on the table, rose slowly to his full towering height, and let his presence fill the room. Every head turned, conversations halted, forks were set down mid-air. He did not shout. He did not gesture wildly. He simply stood, and in that moment, it was as though the entire atmosphere bowed to his composure. His voice, deep and steady, rolled across the hall. "You know," he began, looking directly at Emma and then at Hanover, "I've been sitting here all evening. Not because I couldn't walk away, but because I wanted to see something. I wanted to see how people treat others when they think no one is watching. I wanted to see whether respect is still alive in a place built on appearances." Emma's face paled. Hanover shifted uncomfortably but forced a smirk, though it no longer carried the same confidence. The diners leaned in, hanging on every word. Shaq continued, his tone calm but resonant. "All night, I've been insulted. Not for what I said, not for how I treated anyone, but for the clothes I wore, for the shoes on my feet, for daring to sit in this room without trying to impress anyone. And yet, I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence is the loudest teacher." Emma's hands trembled at her sides. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but no words came. Hanover crossed his arms, trying to appear unaffected, but his eyes betrayed unease. Then Shaq turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the entire room. "What you don't know," he said, his voice rising just enough to fill every corner, is that this restaurant isn't just a place I chose to visit tonight. It's mine. The words detonated in the room like thunder. Gasps erupted from every table. Forks clattered onto plates. Lisa's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat. The Carters exchanged a glance of sheer satisfaction, as though they had expected nothing less. Emma staggered back a step, her mouth falling open in disbelief. Hanover's smirk shattered, replaced with a look of stunned realization. Shaq let the silence hang, giving the truth time to settle in every heart. Then he spoke again, his tone firm but not cruel. I invested in La Lumiere years ago. I believed in its vision, not just as a business, but as a place where people could come together, enjoy good food, and feel respected. But tonight, I saw something different. I saw arrogance. I saw prejudice. I saw people judged not by their hearts but by their clothes. And that, he paused, his eyes locking onto Emma, then Hanover, is not what this place was built for. The room remained silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Emma's face burned with shame. Hanover shifted uncomfortably, his authority crumbling in the face of truth. Shaq's gaze softened as he turned toward Lisa, who still stood frozen near the bar. And yet, he continued, I also saw kindness. I saw someone who, even in a place that values appearance above all else, chose to show respect. That's what this restaurant should stand for. That's what true class looks like. Lisa's cheeks flushed, tears pricking her eyes. She had only done what felt right, never imagining it would matter this much. Shaq took a step forward, his towering presence casting a long shadow across the marble floor. Let this be a lesson, he said, his voice deep and unwavering. Wealth, power, fame, they don't make us better than anyone else. The only thing that makes us better is how we treat people. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. And with that, the spell broke. Applause erupted, not hesitant, not polite, but thunderous and heartfelt. Diners who had remained silent out of fear now stood to their feet, clapping with admiration. The pianist struck a triumphant chord, as if he too had been waiting for this moment. The Carters raised their glasses high, smiling with pride. Lisa wiped her eyes, her heart swelling. Emma stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes as the realization of her arrogance crushed her pride. Hanover, humiliated, slipped toward the door, his exit unceremonious, his earlier swagger gone. And Shaq, towering in the center of it all, did not bask in the applause. He simply nodded, his smile calm, his lesson delivered. The reveal was complete. The truth was no longer hidden, and La Lumiere would never be the same again. Redemption. Transformation. The thunderous applause that followed Shaq's revelation still echoed through the chandeliers of La Lumiere, but as the clapping began to settle into silence, a new energy filled the air. It was no longer the stiff atmosphere of exclusivity that had weighed upon the diners at the start of the evening. Instead, the room carried a rare humility, as though every guest had just been reminded of something they had long forgotten. That respect, kindness, and dignity were worth more than titles, clothing, or even the food that adorned their plates. Shaq remained standing, his presence immense yet calm, his deep eyes scanning the room. He was not smiling smugly, nor did he wear the pride of someone who had just won a battle. Instead, he looked almost fatherly, as if the applause were not for him, but for the lesso in itself. His words lingered in the minds of everyone present, weaving into their conscience like a quiet hymn. Emma stood frozen near the reception desk. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her cheeks flushed red, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Moments ago, she believed she held the upper hand, that her arrogance and sharp tongue gave her superiority. But now, her foundation had crumbled. Not only had she disrespected a man of global fame, she had disrespected the very owner of the restaurant she worked for. The irony weighed so heavily on her shoulders that she felt as though the room itself had closed in around her. Shaq turned his gaze toward her, not with anger, but with a calm steadiness that cut through her pride more than fury ever could. Slowly, he walked toward her, each step measured, each stride carrying an unspoken authority. The diners remained silent, their eyes following his every move, waiting to see how he would handle the woman who had insulted him so openly. When he finally stood before her, towering yet composed, the room felt suspended in time. Emma could barely meet his gaze. Her lips parted, but no words came. At last, with a trembling voice, she whispered, I didn't know. I didn't realize you were—" Shaq raised a hand gently, silencing her without force. "You didn't need to know," he said softly. "Respect should not depend on who someone is. It should not depend on their wealth, their clothes, their fame, or their power. Respect should be given because we are all human, because we all deserve it." Emma's eyes filled with tears, her throat tightening as his words sliced through the last threads of her pride. For the first time that evening, she saw herself clearly. Not as a guardian of elegance, not as a sophisticated waitress protecting the image of La Lumière, but as a woman who had allowed arrogance to blind her to the simplest truth. She bowed her head, unable to stop the tears that slid down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I judged you unfairly. I let pride control me." The silence in the room deepened. Every diner, every member of the staff leaned closer, holding their breath. They knew Shaq had every right to dismiss her, to fire her on the spot, to humiliate her in the same way she had tried to humiliate him. But instead, his expression softened. "Do you know why I stayed quiet tonight?" he asked her. Emma shook her head, wiping her eyes. "I stayed," he continued, "because life is not about proving people wrong in the moment. It's about giving them a chance to see themselves, to grow, to change. You had the chance to show kindness, and instead you showed arrogance. But you're not the first to make that mistake, and you won't be the last. The question is, what will you do after realizing it?" His words struck her deeply. She lowered her gaze again, her tears falling freely now. "I want to do better," she said quietly. "I don't want to be that person anymore. Please, give me another chance." Shaq studied her for a long moment. His deep eyes searched hers, not for perfection but for sincerity. And when he found it, he nodded slowly. "You'll have it," he said, "but only if you remember this. Every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity. Whether they wear diamonds or sneakers, whether they arrive in a Bentley or on foot. This restaurant will not stand for arrogance. It will stand for respect. Do you understand?" "Yes," Emma whispered, her voice trembling but firm with resolve. "I understand. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me." The room exhaled collectively, as though the lesson had not been for Emma alone, but for everyone present. Diners who had sat in silent judgment earlier now bowed their heads in quiet reflection. Some thought of times they had judged strangers too quickly, others of moments they had valued appearances over humanity. Lisa, standing nearby with tears in her own eyes, felt a swell of pride. The man she had admired for his patience had now shown a depth of compassion that went beyond anything she had expected. Mr. Carter raised his glass again, this time not just in respect, but in admiration. "That," he said softly to his wife, "is what true leadership looks like. Not in punishing, but in teaching. not in pride, but in humility. Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes glistening. "He's not just an owner," she whispered. "He's a guide." Shaq turned then, addressing the entire room, his deep voice rolling through the golden light like a sermon. Tonight wasn't about food. Tonight was about something far more important. Too many times in life, we judge by what we see. We decide someone's worth by their clothes, their money, their status. But greatness is not measured by those things. Greatness is measured by kindness, by patience, by how we treat those who cannot give us anything in return. The diners erupted in applause again, this time not just for the man, but for the truth he had spoken. Many stood, clapping with genuine emotion, their earlier pride replaced with humility. Some even wiped their eyes, touched by the raw simplicity of his lesson. Emma, still trembling, looked around the room at the applause she did not deserve, but which reminded her of the forgiveness she had been given. She vowed silently that she would never again let arrogance define her actions. She would treat every guest with dignity, no matter who they were. As the applause finally settled, Shaq smiled Getly, and returned to his seat, not with the air of a conqueror, but with the peace of a man who had done what he came to do. He finished his dessert slowly, chatting briefly with Lisa when she passed by, thanking the Carters for their silent support, and offering small smiles to diners who now looked at him with admiration rather than judgment. When he finally rose to leave, the entire restaurant stood in unison, as though instinctively honoring him. He nodded once more, his towering figure illuminated by the glow of the chandeliers, and walked out into the Beverly Hills night. The glass doors closed behind him, but the lesson remained etched into every heart that had been present. From that night on, La Lumiere changed. Emma transformed from the arrogant waitress into one of the most gracious servers in the restaurant. Lisa's kindness became the standard, inspiring others on staff to lead with humility. The Carters often retold the story of the night Shaquille O'Neal revealed himself, not as a celebrity seeking attention, but as a leader teaching through patience. And the diners who had witnessed the moment carried the lesson with them into their own lives, remembering that respect costs nothing but means everything. As for Shaq, he never boasted about the incident. He never shared it on television or bragged about it in interviews. For him, it wasn't a performance. It was simply another chance to live by the principle his mother had taught him long ago. Respect everyone, no matter who they are. Because respect, in the end, is what makes us truly human. And that was the night La Lumiere stopped being just a restaurant. It became a symbol, a reminder that greatness is not measured by what you own, but by how you treat those around you.